Well, a lot of great memories after 10 years of horsepower. You know, we've had a lot of great project cars on this show, too. Well, like the Supernova here. Big inch motor, big visual statement. That thing attracted attention everywhere it went.
Hey, old man, quit living in the past. You know, some of these project cars were really cool, but we've got one in the works right now that I'm sure you haven't seen built on a show like this. It's a little wild, a little dirty, and definitely on the edge.
A lot of people do sneeze at this, but we really like the rat rods. It's just something where you can bring them out here, not to worry about ropes, and please do not touch signs, and scratches and dings doesn't really matter.
In a way, the first hot rods were mostly rat rods, junkyard bodies, pillaged parts, and homemade horsepower. The kind of cars that invaded the Bonneville salt flats back in the early 50s.
Like our parents came back from World War II, you know, they started building hot rods, you know, and that's kind of what this stuff represents.
Yeah, today rat rods are back and hotter than ever, and the craze covers many generations. It's all thanks to guys like the owner of this 37 Ford truck that sits on a 36 Ford frame. And it's powered by a Flathead, of course. Is it beautiful to you?
Oh, I love it. I've got some other cars that are shiny and I'm tired of cleaning them. When you're sitting behind it, you get some people shaking their heads yes and some people shaking their heads no. But all in all, you know, it's what street rotting came from, and I think that's what it's going back to.
Rat rods are like rusty snowflakes, and some of the differences come in the cool, creative touches.
The battery's in the military box. It's a gel racing battery. It's just plain old twine. Took us 6.5 hours. We drilled all the holes and webbed it, and then my mother's got about 13 layers of lacquer on it to make it hard.
Well, this rat is the proud possession of Greg Jordison. What is it? A 1927 Phaeton on a Model A body, and for power, a simple but solid 283. It's a project that converted he and his buddies from slick street rods to the rat revolution.
I said, hey, you know, this is a lot of fun. Let's just start building hot rods instead of building street rods.
And the main difference?
Probably you don't have to worry so much about the fit and finish. Go for an attitude. You know, some people say, well, what color are you going to paint it? And I said, man, it's already got paint on it. You're going to finish that? I said, it's finished. You know, well, I wouldn't drive that. That thing's kind of ugly. And I said, well, heck, we have a lot of fun in them.
But by now, my horsepower honcho and I were ready to have some fun, too. So back home, we set out to find the right rat candidate to start our own project.
That was so old anyway.
The perfect, well-worn body among this rusted sea of candidates.
We want rough and not that rough. What do you think? 28, 29 Roadster?
Yep, this was it. A 29 Roadster body, still solid enough to enjoy new life as the beginning of the official horsepower rat ride.
Well, ain't she a beauty? Now, some people like to paint them, some people like to put them in primer, but we're leaving our Model A pretty much how you see it.
That's right. Now, our next move, though, is to find a suitable frame for it. And, well, since finding a safe, solid original is pretty tough these days, we got a plan for this rat we'll share with you next week.
Meanwhile, stick with us. We've got another bang for the buck combo test coming up after the break.
That's right. Now, we got to get a name for this thing.
What do you got in mind? Today, rats rule in the horsepower shop, and why not? Rat rods have been around for a long time, but now they're more popular than ever. And this 41 Ford pickup getting ready to roll in is a perfect reason why.
And this one, like any true rat rod, has a classic V8 for power, an original real steel body, of course, and more than a few personal creative touches. Well, like the Pepsi sign floorboards. Oh, and how about that rubber rat for a shifter boot, and the ever popular skull for a shifter knob. Oh, and the inverted beer bottle, well, that's the gas gauge.
A few weeks ago, we found this 2829 Model A Ford at a local rod shop. and we think it's a great start for our own horsepower rat rod project. The only thing now though is a frame, and for that we need something that's stout, safe, and definitely serves a purpose.
Yeah, it's a pretty important step. So to do our homework, we went away from home at the annual Street Rod Nationals up in Louisville, Kentucky. Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, 95 grand.
Let me write a check.
Yeah.
Man, if we can't get some cool ideas and a jump start on our rat rod project here, something's bad wrong.
Yeah, and if you've never been to the Street Rod Nationals, it's not just about rat rods. It's pre-49 American iron. And just to let you in on it, there's a little over 11,000 of them.
Yeah, they've got an eye full of cool cars here, but Gally and I were on a mission.
They've got a little bit of everything.
You see, we had to find the right chassis for our Roadster body, one that we can channel for ride height. And here inside this building, loaded with vendors, we found two allies to make our project work. The first was here at Pete and Jake's booth. This company's been helping out hot rodders for over 30 years, offering everything in the way of parts. They were among the first to feel the rat rod craze.
The popularity of them is just phenomenal. I get more and more calls on the rat rod or rat rod style.
Really?
I sell parts to guys where they want them in plain, and they take them and set them outside. Get them as rusty and as patina as possible, then bolt them on the car.
We discovered they could hook us up with everything from a bare chassis to one that's fully tricked out, like this 32. Now, this was our choice until Jason Slover gave us a heads up.
It's one of those situations where, in doing it, you typically wouldn't want to channel the body because a 32 frame is aesthetically pleasing in its looks. I mean, it's a very, very nice frame. It's the only frame Henry Ford put the reveal in the side. So most of the time, if you see a 2829 on deuce rails, it's usually kept up. It's kept up on the rail itself. It's not then channeled down over. Most of your channels are done with the Model A frames primarily.
Okay, a Model A frame that we can channel. Sounds good. And for that, Jason sent us over to Honest Charlie's booth where a Pete and Jake's version was right on display.
Sort of like building a house. If you start with a good foundation, you're likely to have a good result. Similarly with an automobile, particularly a street rod, if you start off in the wrong direction, it's hard to get on track. So I think, particularly in this case, you started off with a good platform, you're going to have a wonderful project. At the end of the course, we're working on a vehicle that anybody should be able to complete. And hey, you guys ought to be able to complete it too.
You think we can do it?
I think that there's a good probability.
Here's what we wound up with. Now, it may look like a rusty Model A original, and that's exactly the idea. But this is a brand new one from Pete and Jake's, like the one you just saw. We just had ours powder coated in this natural rust that's even got texture.
Now, a bare frame is a great way to start. That way you don't spend all your money at once and you still won't make mistakes. You see, it's got brackets already welded on. And check this, pilot drilled mounting holes with nutserts. All right, next step, make this thing a rolling chassis with more parts we got from Pete and Jake's.
We'll get started by hanging this 9-inch rear end. Now this thing comes with our axles, 11-inch drum brakes, and a 300 rear gear.
We're going to mount it to the frame with this ladder bar kit. It's got urethane bushings up front here, and out back, these adjustable clevises. Of course, these brackets welded onto the rear end at the right angle make this job easy and foolproof. Next, we can bolt up a pair of these alloy gas shocks made especially for hot rods. Now, we like these because they have a 5-position dampening adjuster to give us the ride we want. Well, finally, this panhard bar is going to keep the rear end from moving laterally. It too uses urethane bushings, and it's adjustable here on the end. Hey, guess what? That's it for the rat rod's rear end. Of course, we'll finish making our chassis a roller and show you how we channel the body to sit on it. But speaking of channels, don't go switching yours. We'll be back right after the break. Hi, and welcome back to the Horsepower Shop and our Model A rat rod buildup. Now, just in case you've joined us late, here's what we've been up to. We first found us a topless 2-seater body to start the project, then headed to the Street Rod Nationals where we found a frame we liked from Pete and Jake's Hot Rod Parts. After getting our bare frame powder coated in natural rust, we started building it up first with a 9-inch rear end equipped with 11-inch drum brakes and 300 gear. We hung it under the frame using ladder bars and coilover shocks. And to keep it centered, we added a panhard bar.
To finish making this thing a rolling chassis, we need to assemble the front end, and we'll start by hanging these hairpins. Now these things locate the front axle, and they're made out of a 7/8 steel tubing, and just like the rear ladder bars, they have adjustable clevises. We just went the extra step to have ours chrome plated. The axle we got from Pete and Jake's is a Super Bill. Now this is an I-beam design with a 4-inch drop, and it's been cross-drilled. It also accepts a Ford spindle, and it gets attached to the hairpins with this spring perch. Next, we can install the lower shock mount, which bolts on the bottom side of the spring perch below the axle.
Well, now we can bolt up the spring pack, which is a super slide from Posey that lowers the vehicle about 3 inches. And here's a cool feature that accounts for part of that. They've rolled the pigtail upward instead of downward, which is the conventional way. It installs using shackles that attach the spring to the axle. Then the center of the spring mounts to the bottom of the front cross member, and it's held in place with this plate. Now the front shocks, which attach down here on the spring perch and up top on the frame.
I just pre-assembled our brake kit and spindle. Now the spindle is a 37 to 48 Ford passenger car that allows you to adapt to 78 to 86 GM passenger car caliper. It attaches to the axle using a kingpin, which is secured with a through pin.
Hey, remember the Chevy Vega from about 1971 to 77? They weren't very famous for much except this. It's a steering box that's compact, strong, and very adaptable to hot rod buildups like ours. Now this one's going to mount here on the bracket inside the frame rail. It's a cross steering setup with a drag link that connects the steering arm of the passenger side spindle over to the steering box, and a tie rod connected to the driver's side spindle. Then to control lateral movement, we use a panhard bar to connect the axle to the frame.
Now this rat rod chassis is a true roller, but the wheels and tires are just temporary. Eventually we're going to get a set that gives this thing a lower stance and maybe even a little bit of color.
Well, for my money, you can't go wrong with these Coker red spokes and white walls, but we got plenty of time to deal with that later. Right now, our Pete and Jake's frame comes with this bracket designed to mount up our master cylinder, which of course has the right bore for our disc drum setup. Then we can run our brake lines using mounting holes on the frame. Finally, we even got a brake pedal that's designed to work with our master cylinder. Well, that's it for the chassis buildup. Ought to be even easier next time.
That's right, this was just a mock-up to make sure everything fits right. We'll have to take it all back apart, have some of the bare metal pieces either painted or coated, and put it all back together again. But not before we get started on our rat rod body. We're going to do some grinding, a whole lot of cutting, and even fit it to the frame right after the break, so stick with us.
Hey, welcome back to the Horsepower Rat Rod build-up. We just finished mocking up a chassis for this 29 Roadster. Now we're going to make this well-seasoned body fit onto it.
Yeah, and I'm bracing the body using some 1-inch square tubing. Now this is going to keep it from flexing and twisting when we cut the floor out to channel it. Now what this involves is cutting the area of the floor where the body is going to sit on the frame. We're also going to lose the entire floorboard and replace it with something special later on. As you can see, it took several pieces of square tubing to build this structure that also doubles as a stand for the body. Now it may look like a little overkill, but this body weighs close to 500 pounds, and when we're working under it, I don't want it to fall on my skinny butt. We're sitting our body on some of this snap lock flooring to protect our black and white tiles when we use the plasma cutter.
Right now, time to make some measurements on this chassis using the nut search as a reference. This way we'll know where to make our marks on the body so we can weld up some body mounts. Well, we can tell now that the mounting holes on the body here are about a ½ inch wider than the nut certs on the chassis, but it's not going to matter because all this material is getting cut away from here on back.
First, we'll plasma cut the floor pan out of the way. By the way, anytime you're cutting this much old metal with a plasma cutter, you're going to create a lot of fumes. So a piece of equipment like this Plymouth multi-fume caddy comes in real handy. Now we can also make our cuts along the inside of the original rail. Now that the floor is cut out of the body, I place these mounts down here on the frame. Now we're going to attach these using some more 1-inch square tubing on the inside and outside of the frame rail. We're using more tubing to attach the two sides of the body mount frame together. Now what this will do is keep everything squared when we weld it into the body itself. And this front piece, well, it's only temporary. It's going to have to go when we drop in the engine and transmission. Now that it's all welded up, I know it's going to fit over the frame rails because it was built on the chassis. Now all we need to do is get it squared up with the body. Once it's aligned, you can start bracing it and welding it up. With the upright supports welded in, we're ready to set this thing on the chassis. But first, we need to get the stand out of the way. Now we need to clearance the back of the body for these shock mounts. So after that, a little more cutting with the plasma cutter. Man, it was a lot of work, but we got the entire floor cut out of the rat rod, not to mention most of the bracing done to support the body.
Looks great.
And where have you been with Mikey's?
I got to tell you, that brush guard on your truck comes in real handy when you're out gathering new floor pans.
Oh, you're
what do you
kidding
think? Here's my personal favorite.
That is too cool. Nobody saw you do it, did they?
I don't think so. You won't see this thing for a while, which is officially now called the Raunchy Rat, but we'll be back in several weeks to build the motor, transmission.
And we're gonna have fun with all of it. Meanwhile, stay tuned because we got more horsepower coming up.
What do you think about this one?
That's gonna be the firewall.
Yeah.
That is cool. Hey, our rat rod's back in the shop today to get some classic American horsepower. Now, we kicked off the build of this thing we called the Raunchy Rat several months ago, catching a wave of a fun new and old rat rod craze. In fact, here's how it all went down. We first found a topless two-seater body to start our project. Then headed to the Street Rod Nationals where we found a frame we liked from Pete and Jake's Hot Rod Parts. After getting our bare frame powder coated in natural rust, we started building it up. First with a 9-inch rear end equipped with 11-inch drum brakes and a 300 gear. We hung it under the frame using ladder bars and coilover shocks. And to keep it centered, we added a panhard bar. We finished the front end by first hanging the hairpins, then a front axle with a 4-inch drop. We put in a super slide spring pack, set of front shocks, brakes and spindles, and we also installed a Chevy Vega steering box. Later, we welded together square tubing to brace the body and keep it from flexing, and used the plasma cutter to get rid of the floor pans. Soon we were able to set the body on top of the frame for a test fit.
Well, the Raunchy Rat's been waiting long enough. It's time to give it a motor that's worthy of the image. Now, guys are putting all kinds of engines in rat rods these days, and that's part of the fun. But for us, the only way to go was with the motor that started the whole hot rod craze, the classic Ford Flathead.
During its 31-year production run, there were several displacement versions of the fabled Ford Flathead, though none made more than about 125 horsepower. It took the imagination of post-war gearheads and new performance parts to make it the preferred power plant for early hot rods. Today, the Flathead enjoys a revved-up revival. The cool look powering all kinds of vintage hot rods, highboys, restored classics, and last but not least, rat rods. but it took a lot of ingenuity and innovation to make it more powerful and dependable for modern-day use. And that's where Motor City Flatheads comes in. A few years ago, I met the founder and flathead guru, Mark Kirby, who's come up with more improvements for the motor than any gearhead going today. Well, like a main strap that adds strength to the three main rotating assembly, oversized valve guides that help prevent oil leaks, a free-flowing oiling system with a remote oil filter that never existed on the stock one. Well, the list goes on, but the result is a flathead that's not only classic-looking and durable, but one that makes over 250 horsepower and over 300 foot-pounds of torque. It all starts with an old block that has to be stripped, baked, and carefully cleaned before machining. And for that, we took our POWERBLOCK to hardcore racing in Flint, Michigan. Under the guidance of John Lahone, the block was decked on a CNC machine to ensure the heads are exactly 90 degrees. Then onto another machine that bores the cylinder bores so they're exactly perpendicular to the deck and to the bore center line, vital for perfect piston movement. Next, the cylinder honing ensures a proper finish so the rings will seal with no blow-by. These guys are thorough, even checking each new cylinder rod to make sure they're exactly round and to size.
That it's about 1 1/2, 2/10 small. It's in the red. It's already out to the zero.
Then John goes over here to measure the three mains before he line hones them. Next step, weighing all the valve train components, and this tells the tech what bob weight to use so the crankshaft can be balanced properly.
It's pretty flat. That means it's pretty close to balance.
And here's our freshly machined block, all painted red and ready for a build-up with the help of our buddy Mark here, of course. 75 years since they introduced this thing. Amazing.
Talk about build Ford tough. Boy, it just stood the test of time, didn't it?
It sure did. Speaking of time, they haven't built one in a long time. What's your take on the resurgence and popularity of the Flathead for things like the Rat Rod?
For so many years, people beating up the junkyards trying to find parts, and now with stuff readily available over the counter and all the state-of-the-art ignitions, what have you, I think it's making people go back to Flatheads.
Good answer. Well, we're going to show you how to use some of the new stuff to build a classic old motor. It's going to be fun. Those guys did a good job here.
Yep, sounds like it's going to be a fun project.
Well, it's Flatheads forever today in the horsepower shop as we build our own for the Raunchy Rat back there. Well, here's what goes in the bottom end of our Flathead block. It's a complete rotating assembly from Honest Charlie's that includes a scat crankshaft, set of forged pistons, and billet connecting rods that you saw getting measured earlier on. Now, it's for a 3 5/16 inch bore by a 4 1/8 stroke, and, well, that equals 286 inches. Of course, the kit also comes with a complete set of bearings and rings for our flathead pistons.
Here's the Super Deluxe cam kit we picked up from Goler's Hot Rods. Now, it comes with everything you need to install it in the camshaft. Well, it's a tried and true grind from Motor City Flatheads. Just check out the ramp angle on the cam lobe. After plugging the oil galley here, we can install our camshaft first. Notice how we installed this aluminum cam gear on the front of it.
All right, speaking of that, Mr. Expert, some guys are still using this old style gear made of phenolic. Why not here?
Not a good plan. They used the phenolic because it ran a lot quieter, and of course they were concerned with being quiet. The way that's fastened to this aluminum hub, we're doubling the spring pressure going to a modified cam, and it will come apart here. So for that reason, we always go to a one-piece, just a solid aluminum cam gear. Don't have any problems.
Good tip.
We've already tested our crankshaft to make sure it spins freely. Now we need to install this end seal over some silicone. Now notice this Kevlar-like material. This will cause a little drag against the crankshaft, which will make for a good seal.
Well, now we can drop in our crankshaft for real this time. And notice how we've installed this gear, oil slinger, and sleeve on the end of it. Before installing the main caps, line up the dots on the crank and cam gears to make sure they're in sync. After dropping on the 3 main caps, we're going to use a center cap strap like this for extra strength. Now notice how this cap's been milled flat to accommodate this foot. That's going to spread the load out. Now, it's important to use moly lube on these ARP main studs to get the right torque value, which, by the way, is 85 foot-pounds. Finally, the center strap bolt goes in, finger tight only.
With the gasket in place and some moly lube on the thrust surface and the seal, we can install the front cover.
Well, next, with the motor turned over so this surface is flat and I can see straight down to the crank, I'm going to install the pistons and rods. And here's something important. See that little tang on the rod bearing? Make sure you have it pointing to the outside. Then we carefully tap in the piston, making sure the rod doesn't nick the crank journal on the way down. Now with some oil on this bearing and making sure the tang matches up, we can install the rod cap. By the way, the torque specs on these boats is 45 foot-pounds.
We're using a set of Edelbrock's aluminum flathead cylinder heads for our motor. Now these things have a larger water capacity, excellent breathing characteristics, and they'll give us a compression ratio of 8:1. Now we're not going to bolt them on right now, but we are going to make sure we have the proper piston to head clearance. To do that, make sure the bolt holes are lined up. And while holding the head in place, turn the motor over, and you'll feel the piston slightly lift the head off the deck.
The minimum piston to head clearance on a flathead is 30 thousandths. So Mike and I are going to place feeler gauges of that thickness under each corner of the head. Now, all I got to do is press down on the head, spin the motor over, and listen and feel for any contact. Well, it feels like we're in pretty good shape, so now I can remove the head and we can move on to the valve tray.
The valve and spring assembly is totally unique to the flathead, so we're going to show you how they get assembled. First, take a lubed up valve, slide on the valve guide with installed O-ring, shims, spring and retainer, and finally, your locks. Hey Mark, I noticed you chamfered the top edge of this O-ring. What's all that about?
When you go to put this in the lifter bore, there's a sharp edge. A lot of times, if you don't chamfer this, as you go in, it'll catch and tear this thing, then you got a problem.
After you drop in each valve assembly, you need to secure it by compressing the spring and sliding the horseshoe clip into the guide. Next, after adjusting the valves, here's something that's really important. The camshaft lobe sprays oil out of these holes. This baffle allows that oil to be captured in the upper part of the valley. That's the only way the upper part of the engine gets lubrication, so that is a mandatory piece. Finally, we need to install this mechanical fuel pump bushing. And since we're using an electric fuel pump, we have to plug it.
Anyone who's run an original flathead motor knows the oil filtering system, or lack of it, was a big drawback. Here's how Mark solved that problem. He takes a stock oil pump like this, blocks it internally so the oil is forced up to this new plate, out the plate to a bulkhead fitting, through a hose to a remote filter, and you can mount this anywhere. Then the oil goes out another hose onto the back of the motor.
As you've seen so far, there are a lot of small pieces that can fall through the block of a flathead engine. That's why we've waited to put the pan on until now. Now we got this spec'd out from Goler's Hot Rods, and it came off of a 49 Merc. Now Phil Goler actually came up with this dipstick flange repair kit that consists of this plate being tack welded on the inside of the pan. It allows this flange to be bolted on the outside instead of using rivets like in the old days.
Well, now we can go ahead and tighten up the bulkhead fitting on the pan, and check this out. As long as this slot here is pointing toward the bottom of the pan, we know there's no kinks in the hose that's inside the pan.
With the pan bolted up, we can install the dipstick flange and screw in the dipstick tube. Now we'll button up our old flathead and get to work on its new age power adder. Make sure you stick with us.
Hey, welcome back to more flathead fun here in the Horsepower Shop. Here's something cool I just learned. If you turn the motor over so that number one cylinder is at top dead center on the compression stroke, there it is, well, you can bolt up the cylinder heads knowing that your timing is right on.
Since the heads go into water, we want to make sure we treat them to a coat of sealer. And we'll torque them down to 50 foot-pounds.
Flatheads use 2 water pumps. You can get either new or, in this case, rebuilt original. Now, notice how we got the balancer installed with the timing mark lined up with the pointer.
The crankcase on these old Flatheads only had one way to breathe, and that was out of a breather. Up until now, Goler's Hot Rods came up with this unique PCV kit. And it consists of a bushing that presses into the block, a PCV valve that screws into it, connected to an oil-resistant vacuum hose.
You know, for our money, the only thing better than a flathead is a supercharged flathead. So we're going to install this Magnuson root style kit that comes with a cast aluminum intake with cross-flow equal-length runners. Before bolting it up, though, we got to connect that vacuum hose to this fitting underneath. The blower itself is made with Eaton components and can make up to 60% more power. We'll probably run ours with about 3 to 4 pounds of boost.
To feed it, we're using a 500 CFM Edelbrock carburetor with a manual choke. Now here's a fabbed up hardline we ran from the intake to a vacuum port on the carburetor. With the PCV hardline attached, gases are going to be reintroduced into the induction system and burned rather than being introduced into the atmosphere when using an original style breather.
Well, next we're going to install the alternator bracket, the idler pulley, a 102 amp alternator we got from PowerMaster, and then route the belt. Our distributor is an MSD Pro Billet ready to run made for 49 through 53 flatheads, along with a set of their 8.5mm wires that we've cut to the proper lengths. But finally, here at the back of the intake, instead of the old grommet breather that used to blow oil all over the firewall, Groller's fabbed up this little piece that has 3 purposes. It's a baffle, breather, and even a filler for the oil. But now that we got the flatty finished, time to get it off the engine stand so we can install our flywheel, clutch, and tranny, and for that you might be a little surprised.
We're going to set the engine on our old steel table, then bolt up a center force flywheel made for the Flathead, along with one of their dual friction clutches. You know, it wouldn't be a righteous rat rod with an automatic transmission, so we gave Shadow Rods a call and they sent us one of their world-class T5s with an S10 tail housing. Now they stuffed it with a 295 main gear set, and 5th gear has a 37% overdrive. Plus it'll be plenty to handle the power we're making in our old Flathead. To make it all work though, we need to use one of their adapters that allow us to bolt the T5 to the original bell housing. Finally, we can install the transmission and the original inspection plate. We'll install the starter in a few weeks when we drop the motor and transmission in the car, but in the meantime, we've got to go raid a couple local junkyards and even go through some old barns. You see, we've got some pretty crazy parts in mind to give this old rodent a real personality.
And welcome back to the Horsepower Shop, where we just built a classic flathead for our Raunchy Rat here, starting with a cast iron block. But if you want the ultimate flathead, you might want to start with one of these, man. Check this out. 70 pounds, an aluminum block that Mark developed for his joint venture with Shadow Rods. And hey, man, I know this is just a rough prototype, but what are some of the features you got?
Well, you know, being that it's aluminum block, it was difficult to get sleeves in here and know you're going to get them to seal. So we developed a way to come in from the bottom and screw the sleeve in, seat it underneath the deck.
Cool.
We also developed all the ports on the flow bench. It'll have hardened seats and bronze guides. You won't have to do any port polish and relieving. That'll all be CNC machined. The studs that go right around the cylinder that directly affect upper bore distortion now go deep down into the block, totally eliminating upper bore distortion.
Cool. Well, send us one anytime you want to. Hey, man,
we'll do that.
You are the man when it comes to flatheads. Thanks for your help.
Been a pleasure. Remember, real hot rods don't have valve covers.
I will.
Looks can be deceiving and fun when you're building an old rat rod or a street rod. Now here's a PowerMaster Power Gen alternator that's made to look like an old style generator. It's got a 1-wire hookup, produces 75 amps, and you can get it in either black powder coat like this or in a polished version. Now the casing and all the brackets were designed to resemble an old style generator. All you need to do is generate about $370 out of your wallet to have one.
Well, here are a couple of more new items to give a retro look to your street or rat rod. These come from Honest Charlie's. Here's an aluminum finned air cleaner for your carb that measures 4 inches in diameter and would look great on a 3-do setup. In fact, you get a set of 3 for $110. Then there's this matching custom coil cover that looks great wrapped around a Mallory style ignition coil. This piece goes for about $30. Now, as Mike mentioned earlier, the Rat returns in a few weeks so we can finish it up and go out and terrorize the neighborhood. Meanwhile, something totally different, something very cool for you next week. Come hang out with us. The Rat's back for another round of work here in the horsepower shop, and hey, we're glad you joined us. Now, we call this project the Raunchy Rat, although it's really a '29 Ford Roadster that we're transforming into a cool retro rat rod. Last time it was in here, we built it a motor, a Ford Flathead, of course, using parts we got from Shadow Rods and Goler's Hot Rods. Oh, we also pumped up the power with a Magnuson Supercharger.
We've got the body back off of the frame so we can put the motor and transmission into place. Now we're going to go ahead and bolt the transmission mount up and use that as a guide to weld in our new motor mounts. Now in case you've looked close enough, we've already got mounts on our Pete and Jake's chassis, but they're set up for small block Chevrolet, so they've got to go.
Okay. All right, better start loading it. Now, that's right on it.
After bolting the transmission to the mount, we square up the front of the motor between the frame rails and measure for the new mounts. Then after cutting them to the proper width, we can weld them in place. Now the mounts and bushing kits to cut down on the chassis vibration both came from Chassis Engineering.
Well, we've got plenty of room with body off. We're going to make sure the Raunchy Rat has brakes and a clutch. All thanks to this kit we got from Pete and Jake's that includes a dual brake master cylinder, a single aluminum clutch cylinder, and aluminum slave cylinder. Plus, we got the pedals we need, and last but not least, this frame mount with a welded on pivot tube. But before we can install this stuff, this original bracket for a single master cylinder has to go. Then the bracket welds up to the frame an inch from the top, and we can bolt up the master cylinder and the clutch cylinder. Then the pedals slide onto the pivot tube, and with supplied hardware, we attach the plunger to the brake pedal and connect the clutch master cylinder to the clutch pedal. Finally, the slave cylinder, which is what activates the clutch pressure plate when you shift gears. Basically, here's how it works. You press in on the clutch. That moves fluid from the clutch cylinder over to the slave through this fitting, pushing a cylinder up and moving these pieces together, and that's what activates the throwout bearing. Hey, while we're down here, I'm going to go ahead and measure from the transmission seal to this edge of the yoke so we can get us a drive shaft.
With that handled, we're ready to set the body back onto the frame. This time though, we're going to take some measurements so we can cut the firewall to let it clear the engine. Now that we have the frame back under the body, man, I'd have to say this thing looks awesome even without the body all the way down. Now after taking a closer look, we're going to go ahead and remove the whole lower section of the firewall. And we get rid of it by removing some rusty bolts and drilling out a few rivets. Next, we'll lower the body again to check for clearance. And build a tunnel out of square tubing so the transmission will clear. Now with the frame off again, I'll lay in the firewall I just fabbed up. Trim the recessed area for the oil filler relief. And lay in this top plate. Finally, after marking the area for the transmission, we can cut the excess firewall so the transmission will clear.
Got the Rat down on the ground now so we can do something about a floorboard for it. This starts with some sheet metal cut to lengths so we can first just lay them into place. And And with the last piece down, we can drill and pop rivet in place. Then we laid down a layer of this hush mat material for insulation against noise and heat. Now comes the fun part. You might remember a few months ago we went souvenir shopping on the streets for these. Well, really, we got them from a friend at the police department, but wait till you see how we use them to finish the floorboard. Oh, just in case you're thinking about the remote, there you go.
Hey, welcome back to the home of the Raunchy Rat. Now, we just got done recycling some old street signs to finish up our floorboards. What do you think? Now, I know it ain't exactly artwork, but it's definitely different, and that's what rat rodding's all about.
Hey, to get the full effect, though, let's lay in our new seats. And for these, we hooked up with a guy named Richard Amy out of Manteca, California, who hand makes these bomber seats with 5052 aluminum using real aircraft rivets. Nice.
Very nice. Next, we got to get the body back on the frame. So we can measure for some modifications for our clutch and brake pedals. First, they need to be a lot shorter for our channeled body. Then, after cutting a hole for them in the floorboard, we can weld them in at an angle to make room for the throttle pedal, which mounts to the firewall with 2 bolts. We also cut a hole in the floor for our shifter. Now, we picked it up from B&M, and it's a sports shifter that's actually made for an S10. Now, the hole may look a little large, but we're actually going to mount our ignition switch back here.
By the way, that long handle is going to be even longer after this modification. Yeah, remember those pistol grip shifter handles from the 60s? Those Mopar guys ain't got nothing on us. Hey, now, in case you're a little concerned, that pistol only shoots blanks.
Just like you, Joe.
I hope. And it's got a bolt through the barrel now, so not to worry. Okay, now that we got the body bolted to the frame and got plenty of clearance, good time to bolt up this starter, which is a PowerMaster XS torque starter. And don't believe what they tell you about size matters. This mini starter can churn out up to 200 foot-pounds of torque.
Next, I'm going to jump back in the car to install some gauges. Now, when building a rat rod, retro is the only way to go. So we picked up these old-time gauges from Autometer that give you a nostalgic look with the accuracy of a modern core meter. Just check out the needle and the chrome bezel. Since there's no way to get the wiring inside the stock dash, we're mounting the gauges right here on top of the center console. With the holes cut, we can drop our center console back in place and install our gauges. Now we can move on to the fuel system, and we're going to start it out with this little pony keg. Now, I went ahead and cut the top of the keg where the handles are off so it would fit in the car. Next thing to do is go ahead and drill and tap it for a -6 fuel line. Now the keg is just the right size to fit in our trunk. With the trunk floor slid underneath the fuel tank and it bolted in place, we're ready to finish the rest of the fuel system, but that'll come after the break, so make sure you stick around.
Hey, welcome back as we attack our Raunchy Rat here with some more work. In fact, we're getting ready to fix up a way to feed this Ford Flathead. However, let's roll the recap and show you what we've been up to so far. We installed a new hydraulic clutch and brake assembly, laid down a floorboard with some sheet metal, hush mat material, and topped that off with, of all things, street signs. We modified the clutch and brake pedals to properly fit in the car and installed the throttle pedal. And we modified the new shifter, which got a shifter knob that aims to get attention. Then we bolted up the starter, cut some holes for the gauges that we installed in our homemade console, and finally mounted that beer keg fuel tank.
Now we can install our Holley HP 125 fuel pump with a built-in regulator and billet base. Now this thing flows 125 gallons per hour. Here's a tip for you. Anytime you build a fuel system, you want to make sure to run a filter after your tank and before your pump. If not, you could run into a few problems. One, get trash in the pump and kill it, or two, get trash in the carburetor and starve the engine for fuel. So we went ahead and picked up this Earl's inline filter, and we're going to install it after the tank and before the pump. Next, we can complete the fuel delivery system by running some Earl's Prolate hose that will cut to fit.
Well, now that we got a system to feed our Flathead, let's do something about cooling it. This is basically a stock 29 radiator that Walker shortened for us. And you can see on the back, it's got inlets on top and 2 outlets on bottom that'll match up with those dual water pumps. It bolts up in the stock location, then with hoses installed from the radiator to the water pump and on top from the engine to the inlets, the system is finished.
Since we're running our Flathead with forced induction thanks to the blower, we need an ignition box like this MSD 6 BTM. Now, it not only offers a more powerful spark with an adjustable rev limiter, but also has an adjustable timing retard that works off of boost pressure. Now, I know a lot of normal people would mount this on the outside of the firewall or somewhere near the engine compartment, but we're going to be a little different since it is a rat rod. This is where the fuel tank used to be. Now it's going to be home to the ignition box, which we'll secure from the top with hex nuts. Next, after disguising it in an old can and using a hose clamp, we can mount our MSD coil on the firewall.
Well, for wiring on our Rat, we're going with a Painless Performance 8-circuit modular T-bucket wiring harness. It's got all the basics for the headlights, taillights, brake lights, and so forth, and it's color-coded for an easy install. Now, here's a good feature. The fuse box itself is modular, so we can add circuits later if we need to. Well, next time you see this thing, it's going to be wired up, and with any luck, we'll be firing up that Flathead. Well, we're going to miss the good old Raunchy Rat, but it's finally time to button it up, fire it up, take it for a ride, and say goodbye for a while. It's a rat rod that started with an old original 29 Ford body that we dropped over a new reproduction chassis from Pete and Jake's that we got from Honest Charlie's. What makes rat rods so much fun is you get to throw out the rule books and radically make yours one of a kind. In recent weeks, we built a Ford Flathead motor for ours using an original block and some new aftermarket parts. We also installed a Magnacharger root-style blower and mated up the power plant with an S10 transmission. Later on, we installed a new hydraulic clutch and brake assembly, laid down a floorboard consisting of sheet metal, hush mat, and street signs, modified the clutch and brake pedals to fit in the car, installed the throttle pedal, and modified the new shifter. Then we bolted up the starter, cut the holes for the gauges that we installed in our homemade console, and mounted that ever-popular beer keg fuel tank. Then we finished the fuel delivery system with a new pump and filter, mounted a radiator to cool our Flathead, and bolted up the ignition in what used to be the gas tank. Then we installed a basic street rod wiring kit. Now, last time it was here, we finished up the exhaust, including these headers that got modified. We also added some Dietz-style headlights and some old Impala taillights we stole from a muscle car project. Oh, and underneath, we installed our drive shaft, a custom-made piece from CCI Driveline.
One of the biggest challenges with this ride was the steering. Now, due to the size of the motor, there was no way to make a straight shot to the steering box with an aftermarket column. As you can see, we've already tried that once, so we moved on to some Borgeson double D shaft and Heim joints for a Z-shaped configuration. Now, it ain't pretty, but hey, it's a rat rod and it works.
As you might remember, the Flathead uses a remote oil filter, so after shortening the hose, we'll mount ours right here on the firewall. To fill our tank, we thought about using this nice Jazz filling unit, but it's a little too nice for the Rat, so we made a trip to the Tractor Supply store, came up with this galvanized goodie that's a lot more appropriate. And a couple hose clamps is the only hardware we need to make it stay put. Well, you know, it's not exactly ready for the road yet, but we could at least fire it up. You want to?
No, I'll give you the honors, since you're almost as old as the car.
Oh, very funny. Ah, I love that sound. Oh boy, just when you thought it was safe to go on the street again, the Raunchy Rat goes for a cruise. Hi everybody, welcome to the shop. Today we're gonna pay off our ongoing labor of lunacy. Last time we had it in the shop, we gave it some center dump headers from Brandt with a pair of cherry bomb mufflers. For taillights, well, we borrowed a pair from a 61 Impala that was parked outside the muscle car shop. We installed a reproduction deck lid to be coated in natural rust, of course. Then Mike went to the lower 40 to rummage through tractor parts for something we could make a grill out of. That was also the time we installed these Deet-style headlights that were used, but not quite used enough to match the rest of the Rat. So today, we're going to show you what we come up with to give these things some real character.
Yeah, but first, even though a rat rod's a no-frills ride, you don't want to get dirt in your eyes or bugs in your teeth while you're driving one. So we picked up this original Model A windshield off of the internet, which we're going to install on the Raunchy Rat. To install it, we just bolt in the frame hinge at the top and attach the bracket to this stud using washers and wing nuts. Now this is what they called air conditioning back in the late 20s and early 30s. I guess there's no way to really be comfortable in a rat rod, is there?
Since you last saw the car, we had our production assistant and resident artist Hutch sketch out some artwork that was fitting for a horsepower rat rod. Of course, the idea was to make our logo look like it was as old as the body itself. After painting both sides, we turned him loose on the deck lid, painting the official name of the car and even a mascot rat who had apparently overdosed on 40-weight motor oil. Why, Da Vinci himself couldn't have done better.
All right, the next challenge is getting this old Ferguson tractor grill I picked up able to fit on the front of the Rat. We've also got another little problem. We still have to powder coat these old spoke wheels in time to make it to a cruise-in later tonight. Looks like I'm gonna go grab Tech Center Tommy for a little help.
Tommy gets in gear by first cutting the grill insert out of its original assembly.
While Tommy does his thing back in the shop, I'm going to go ahead and get started powder coating these new wheels we got for the rat rod. Now they're 52 spoke street rod wire from Coker Tire. They measure in at 15 by 5 up front, 15 by 7 in the rear. Now we let Joe pick the color since he is so classy, he opted for cream. They've already been blasted and wiped down with acetone. So after giving each one a good coat of powder, they can go into our oven for about 10 minutes after reaching a 400-degree cooking temperature.
Well, meanwhile, Tommy's fitting the old tractor grill insert into the hood and sides. Then he clamps and tacks everything in place before welding it all up. Now he's taking measurements so he can cut the top of the hood to make a new grill assembly. Next, some relief cuts on the hood to clear the blower. Finally, he uses bolts and wing nuts to keep it all in place. Well, Tommy sure did plow through that tractor metal in a hurry, and now we got two options. This look or this look, which I like because if you got a flathead, might as well flaunt it.
Well, the wheels turned out pretty good too, but just wait till you see the retro rubber we're gonna have mounted on them. Now I'm gonna go ahead and take care of that while Joe makes a little barter with our neighbor.
So that's pretty much how you make a run, you got it?
Red for stop, green for go.
Yeah, pretty simple, but not that simple. Little trade-off. Now, you and Ryan can use the dyno jet, have your way with it, but man, you gotta help me make this thing look like the rest of the rat rod.
Okay, have you thought about Fotina?
Not for a long time. I dated her in high school.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about creating an aged look with new paint.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, let me show you what I'm talking about.
Okay, I think she had an aged look too, you know?
Okay, this is super easy. All you're gonna need is some red scuffing pads to prep the surface, some 600 grit sandpaper, a shop towel you can throw away, and 3 different colors of primer, a little bit of water to help you sand. So I'm gonna put you to work.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, we're gonna start with the black primer and put a pretty thick coat on. And we'll let that dry for a few minutes. Now we'll put a coat of red on and make it really wet and fat. Here's where the fun stuff happens. You take your shop towel and you just sort of make a mess. And finally, we'll give a thick coat of gray primer. Looks like you're ready for your next coat, too.
How come I got this old garbage can and a box, and you got that nice toolbox and a vise for yours?
Well, it's kind of to illustrate the point that you don't really need a paint booth, and it doesn't matter if dust gets up in the paint job, so stop whining.
Yeah.
Now, after your primer is dry, use water and 600 grit sandpaper and wet the surface pretty liberally and sand it down until you get the faded look that you're looking for.
All right, Mr. Kevin, how'd Patina and I do here? What do you think?
It looks like you did good. And you know, sanding through the layers kind of creates the illusion that the sun has beat it to death for about 40 years.
It does, it works, man. Well, thanks a lot. Let's get them back on the car.
I got to go back and help Ryan get that truck ready for the dyno.
I knew it.
Knock yourself out.
That's much better. Now everything's evenly aged and trashed. Well, won't be long till Mike's back with those wheels and tires. Then it's off to the local cruise-in for the Raunchy Rat's public debut.
Hey, welcome back. Now we got our tires mounted up on our 52-spoke powder-coated wheels just in time for tonight's cruise-in. For rubber, Coker sent us these skinny ribbed Firestone dirt track tires to use in the front, and then we capped it off with a V8 center cap powder-coated rust. And then the rear, old-style Firestone Deluxe Champions with a groove tread. They're 4-ply tube tires. And they're an inch or two lower than the original tires we had on here for mock-up, giving us even a cooler stance. Well, here we are, the weekly Friday night cruising sponsored by the Murfreesboro Hot Rod Club. All right, Joe said he had to go cover an Oscar race down in Huntsville, Alabama, but I actually think he was a little afraid to ride shotgun with me, so we had Buddy come along. Now we're gonna go see what we can find. Man, I need to get me something like this.
Look at the woodwork on that thing. It's unbelievable.
Phenomenal. Wow.
That's not pieced together, that's formed.
Yeah. Like most local cruisins, you can see a little bit of anything and everything here, from street rods to classics from the 50s. But obviously, nobody's seen a car here that looks quite like our Raunchy Rat.
I like rat rods.
One thing wrong with it. It's not mine.
Looks like it ride a little rough, but it looks pretty cool.
I like the Supercharger on it. You don't see that too much on Flathead.
You know what that is? A tetanus shot. That's what that is, a tetanus shot.
As with all events like this, there's no competition. But if they gave out trophies for attracting stares, the Raunchy Rat would be a first-place shoe-in. All right, the cruising tonight has been a blast, but I've got a little problem. I can't find Buddy. But make sure you guys stay tuned, and we'll see if Joe really did go to a heads-up drag race. I'm gonna go find Buddy and give people a little longer chance to look at the car.